Patel and other leaders took people's property, and the police got really brutal.
Trying to scare them into submission.
Exactly. But the farmers, they were inspired by Patel. They were determined to stand their ground. They refused to budge.
That's incredible. So, did they win?
They did. The movement was just too big, the farmers too determined, and it was getting too much negative attention, both in India and Britain.
So the British backed down.
They did. They reduced the tax hike and let Patel and the other leaders go.
Another victory for Satyagraha. And I imagine that win did wonders for Patel's reputation.
Oh yeah, it definitely did. It earned him the title Sardar, which means leader, and he became a national figure. The Bardoli Satyagraha, it didn't just show how powerful nonviolent resistance could be, it also showed what a strong leader Patel was. He became a symbol of how strong the peasants could be, a real force to be reckoned with.
Okay, so we're seeing these movements becoming more powerful, more organized, and winning some major victories.
Right.
And around the same time as the Bardoli Satyagraha, we also see the All India Kisan Sabha, formed in 1936.
Yeah.
What is the importance of that?
The All India Kisan Sabha, it was a big moment. It showed that the peasant movements were becoming more united, more national.
So it was more than just a bunch of local struggles.
Exactly. Before the Kisan Sabha, these movements were mostly confined to specific regions, focused on local issues. But the Kisan Sabha, it brought all these different peasant groups together under one umbrella.
So they could speak with one voice.
Yes. They could coordinate their struggles, present a united front.
Against who?
Both the British and the landlords.
Okay, so a more unified approach.
Right. And their demands, they were much more radical than what we'd seen before. They weren't just asking for small concessions. They wanted to change the whole system.
Like what? What did they want?
Their main demand was to abolish the zamindari system.
Get rid of it completely.
Yeah, they saw it as the root of all the problems.
Interesting.
They argued that the zamindars, they were just absentee landlords living off the work of the actual farmers, not contributing anything.
They wanted to cut them out.
Exactly. They wanted to redistribute the land, give it to the people who actually farmed it.
To create a fairer system.
Yes, a more equitable society.
And they wanted other things too, right?
Yeah. It wasn't just about land ownership. They wanted better working conditions for laborers, fair wages, and an end to debt bondage.
Which kept so many people trapped.
It did.
Yeah.
And they also fought for the rights of sharecroppers, pushing for policies to protect them.
So they were really trying to improve things for everyone who worked the land?
Exactly. The Kisan Sabha really shaped the conversation about land reform in India.
In the years leading up to independence.
Yeah. Their ideas, their demands, they resonated with the growing feeling of nationalism. And they influenced both the Congress Party and those socialist and communist movements that were becoming more popular.
So they had a wider impact than just on the peasants themselves.
Definitely. They helped make agrarian issues a national priority, making sure the peasants wouldn't be ignored when India became independent.
Now, as we get closer to independence, we see even more peasant movements happening all over India.
Yeah.
It shows how much more politically aware the peasants had become and how determined they were to create a better future.
Right.
The Tepaga movement in 1946 and 1947 focused on the sharecroppers in Bengal. What can you tell us about that?
The Tepaga movement, it was all about standing up for the rights of sharecroppers who had been exploited for so long.
Because the system was really rigged against them.
Yeah, it was. You see, sharecroppers, or bargadars as they're called in Bengali, they farmed land that belonged to landlords, and they had to give a huge portion of their harvest to the landowners as rent.
Like how much?
Sometimes as much as half, which didn't leave much for them to live on.
No, it didn't.
The Tepaga movement wanted to change that. They demanded a bigger share of the harvest.
So instead of half, they wanted
2/3. They argued that they were the ones working the land, so they deserved a bigger share of what they produced.
That's a big ask.
It was. It was a radical idea, a real challenge to how things had always been done. And it showed how much more aware the sharecroppers were becoming of their rights.
Did it work?
Well, it spread really quickly through different parts of Bengal, and they got support from peasant organizations, communist activists, even some people in the Congress Party.
So a pretty broad coalition.
Yeah. But of course, the landlords weren't happy about it.
Not at all, I imagine.
They saw it as a threat to their power and often used violence and intimidation to try to shut it down. And the British, well, they sided with the landlords.
Of course they did.
They used the police and the administration to crush the movement.
So a classic case of those in power trying to hold on to what they have.
Yeah.
But did the Tepaga movement achieve anything?
It did, actually. While they didn't get everything they wanted and the movement was brutally suppressed, it had a big impact. In some places, sharecroppers were able to negotiate a better share of the crops.
Just because of the pressure.
Exactly. And the movement raised awareness about how badly sharecroppers were being treated.
So even though it wasn't a complete victory, it still made a difference.
It did. It laid the groundwork for future changes, for real land reform in India after independence.
Okay, so it was part of a bigger process.
Exactly. It showed that even though they were up against huge obstacles, peasants could mobilize and fight for a fairer system.
Now, as we've seen throughout this deep dive, peasant movements in India weren't just about economics or resisting the British.
Right.
There were other factors at play.
Yeah.
The Telangana movement, which happened from 1946 to 1952, is a great example of that. What made that one so unique?
The Telangana movement, it was a mix of peasant resistance, anti-feudal sentiment, and the struggle against colonial rule.
Wow, all in one.
Yeah, and it all happened while India was becoming independent and dealing with its own problems.
Yeah.
And it happened in Hyderabad state, which was different from most of British India because it was ruled by a monarch.
The Nizam.
Yes, the Nizam. He was technically under British control, but he had a lot of autonomy.
So Hyderabad was kind of his own thing.
Yeah, in a way. And the Nizam, he ruled over a really exploitative feudal system.
So the peasants had it even worse there.
They did, yeah. They were dealing with both the Nizam's oppressive taxes and forced labor and exploitation by these landlords called Deshmukhs and Jagirdars.
So they were getting it from both sides.
Pretty much.
That's a recipe for rebellion.
And eventually that's what happened, but it took a while to really get going.
How did it start?
Well, the Communist Party of India had been organizing peasants and laborers in Telangana for a while.
They were planting the seeds.
They were. They were trying to make people aware of their rights and get them to fight against the system. And by the 1940s, it was starting to work. People were getting restless.
So what finally pushed them over the edge?
Well, there were a few things. People were increasingly unhappy with the Nizam. He wasn't doing anything to help them.
He was just ignoring their suffering.
Yeah, pretty much. And thanks to the work of the communists and other activists, the peasants were becoming more aware of how badly they were being treated.
That awareness is so important.
It is. And then you have the whole independence movement happening all over India.
Right.
That inspired the people in Telangana to fight for their own freedom from both the feudal system and the British.
So it was a mix of things: economic grievances, political ambitions, the influence of the broader independence movement.
Exactly. And once the movement really got going, it spread like wildfire.
Literally.
Well, not literally, but you know what I mean. It spread really fast. Peasants were attacking landlords' estates, taking land, and setting up their own village councils.
Taking control.
Yeah, taking control of their own lives.
So this was a pretty militant movement.
It was. They used armed struggle, guerrilla tactics, the whole thing. They were facing brutal repression from the Nizam's forces, and they didn't have any legal options, so they fought back however they could.
That's intense.
It was. They were incredibly brave, fighting for their land, their dignity, their right to determine their own future.
Amazing. So India gains independence in 1947.
Right.
What did the new Indian government do about this uprising?
At first, they weren't sure what to do.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it was a tricky situation. They were trying to create a new nation, and they were worried about anything that might threaten that.
So they were hesitant to get involved.
They were, but the Telangana movement, it was just too big, too powerful to ignore. It was getting a lot of sympathy from people all over India.
And the Nizam wasn't exactly helping matters, was he?
No, he wasn't. So in September 1948, the Indian Army went in.
What happened?
They annexed Hyderabad and made it part of India.
Wow. So what happened to the movement after that?
Well, it didn't end right away. The communists, they kept fighting, but now they focused on land reforms and giving land to the peasants who didn't have any.
Okay.
And the Indian government, they weren't keen on radical land reforms at first, but they realized they had to do something.
The pressure was too much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they introduced some reforms like getting rid of the Jagirdari system, putting limits on how much land people could own, and redistributing land.
So the Telangana movement did lead to some positive changes.
It did. It came at a high cost, a lot of suffering, but it forced the government to deal with the problem of exploitation and implement reforms that benefited a lot of people. And it showed that the fight for equality didn't end with independence.
What a powerful story.
It is.
It's clear that these movements, they weren't just about immediate problems. They were about creating a fairer and more just society.
Absolutely.
It's inspiring to see how, even against all odds, these movements helped create a more just and equitable India. As we wrap up, what are some of the key takeaways, especially for our UPSC folks who are trying to make sense of all this?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that peasant movements weren't all the same.
Right.
They were incredibly diverse, different regions, different social structures, different political climates. It all played a role.
Makes sense.
So understanding that diversity is key to really grasping what was going on back then.
Okay, so for those studying for the UPSC, how should they approach this topic? Just memorizing dates and names? Or is there a better way?
Knowing the key facts is important, but the UPSC is really looking for analytical skills, critical thinking.
Right.
So I'd encourage aspirants to think about these movements thematically.
Or thematically.
Yeah, instead of just memorizing the details of each movement, try to see the common threads.
Okay.
What were the root causes of all this unrest? How did these movements change over time? How did they connect with the whole nationalist movement? What kind of impact did they have?
So it's about seeing the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that's not just helpful for exams, it's how we really learn from history.
It's about seeing history as a living thing, right?
Yes, full of complexities, contradictions, and lessons that we can apply today.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned the impact of these movements. What would you say are some of the most important legacies they left behind?
Well, one of the biggest legacies is their role in shaping land reforms and agricultural policies after independence.
Okay.
Things like abolishing the zamindari system, setting limits on land ownership, and redistributing land, all of that goes back to the struggles of those peasants during colonial times.
They were fighting for the future.
They were. And those reforms, they had a huge impact on rural India. Millions of farmers were empowered, the whole agrarian landscape changed.
So they weren't just thinking about their own problems, they were thinking about future generations.
Yes, exactly. And another important legacy is how they contributed to political awareness and mobilization, especially in the countryside.
Getting people involved.
Right. They brought issues of social justice, economic inequality, political representation, all of that to the forefront.
It wasn't just about land, it was about people having a say in how they were governed.
Absolutely. And finally, they left this incredible legacy of resistance, resilience, and collective action that continues to inspire people today.
That's powerful.
It is. The courage of those peasants, the power of nonviolent resistance, their vision of a better world, it's still relevant today.
It shows that these stories aren't just history. They're a source of inspiration.
Absolutely.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into peasant movements in colonial India. We hope you found it insightful. To all our UPSC aspirants, remember, it's not just about the facts. It's about understanding the bigger picture, the connections, the long-term consequences. And to everyone else, if you're interested in history, dig deeper, explore these stories. There's so much to learn. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. We'll see you next time.